For the record that it's the 11th of June 2013. We're interviewing Don Watson at the State Library of Queensland, and interviewing you is Deborah and myself, Janina, Gosseye. Yeah. We're interviewing you in preparation of a public forum. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, you can go back further if you want to and say, the whole problems of Brisbane relate, and I've said this in the transportation talks, but it relates to the very narrow peninsula on which the city was sited, the topography which made access to that peninsula fairly difficult, like there are hills enclosing it or whatever, and the river, of course, enclosing the peninsula, which made access difficult. It needed bridges and all that sort of stuff. So that constrained the CBD, so there wasn't much room in the CBD for traffic changes, so that was always a bit of an issue. And that led to that Cross River Commission in 1926 after Greater Brisbane was created, and that was for its time a comprehensive transportation plan for the city, a very elaborate scheme for very long term for the additional bridges and the like. Then no town plan resulted in Brisbane. I'm not an expert on the town plan, but after Greater Brisbane Council was established, they did try to work towards getting a town plan, and good people were employed, well-known planners and things for various times, but for one reason and another, and the Depression would be one, that the whole thing never came to fruition. And that was still the case after the Second World War. They were still working towards a town plan for the city, and various planners and things came out and worked on it and contributed to British planners in particular. But one of the things that I think did evolve from that was some ideas about how the road network might work. And by then, of course, the Story Bridge had been built, so the city was a bit more connected, but there was already talk for a bridge at Gardens Point.
How does the trams fit into this story?
Well, the trams were pre-existing, of course, and they all depended on the Victoria Bridge. And there were a couple of issues, and I'll get them out of sync, but there was a major fire that destroyed the Paddington tram depot, so they lost a proportion of their tram stock. And people do claim that it was the Victoria Bridge that finally jeopardised the rebuilding of this bridge, because from the 1920s there'd been a very good study done by two students who proved that the bridge was structurally endangered, and so that limited the number of trams per span to one and all that sort of stuff. But the truth of the matter is that the Victoria Bridge was planned that it could take trams, and so that wasn't necessarily ruled out. But the transportation people preferred buses anyway, so they probably contributed to an environment in which the trams were seen as a bit old-fashioned and less flexible and a whole lot of things. Anyway, and eventually a decision was made after the fire where they didn't have enough trams anyway for the network, and they bought a lot of buses from Sydney, second-hand ones and the like. When the bridge was built, then they decided they'd get rid of them. But it was also, I think, no, maybe it wasn't. I was going to say it was probably called into question by the ideas of the transportation plan to make more of the city roads one way. Like before the transportation plans, there were only two one-way streets, Anne and Elizabeth Streets, and they ran in the opposite direction to the one they run in. But to get that whole network of roads working, but I don't think so when you think about it. I mean, the trams were and there were no trams in Ann Street, I don't think. They were only in Adelaide and Queen, so wasn't affected by the transportation plan. Wharf Street, there were trams. Edward Street had trolley buses, but none of that's affected. So I don't think that was necessarily affected by the transportation plan. Anyway, I'm sure that the plan enabled, or the building of the bridge anyway, which was concurrent with all this stuff, and by the same people, by the same client body, didn't jeopardise trams. But anyway, a decision was made at that time, or about that time, that the trams would be abandoned. So they are mixed up in it, but anyway, it was at that time.
So what date's this?
1966 or 7, the end of the tram. The transportation plan is 65, but the trams kept going after that. I think it's about 68 or whatever. I'd probably have the date somewhere.
And you said that the redevelopment of these squares in the city centre were all tied up with the transportation plan.
Well, they were, but I think they also existed before the plan was presented. I mean, this plan, where people see at the time and protested about it as a terrible imposition by a big firm of American transportation engineers ripping shit out of the city. The reality is that the bones of it all existed back in the work that the council had already been doing, and although it was much more substantial further out from the CBD and more freeway like in the CBD along the Riverside Expressway. The broad pattern of radial distributor roads and things had been anticipated by the council anyway, and as part of that, I think it would have been a response to the problem of the number of cars accelerated absolutely, and Main Roads becomes a very wealthy department collecting registration from this absolutely accelerating income base, and so that the need to provide parking was an issue before the transportation plan, but then there was a specific transportation study done quite soon after that, within a year or two only, and then there was a public transportation one done too that's completely forgotten, I think.
And which one? The Wilbur-Smith plan? Which one?
Is 1860. They're all done by Wilbur-Smith,
yes.
the American consultants.
Yes.
But the first one was the transportation plan in 1965. Then there was a parking study done that I don't think I've ever necessarily looked at. And then there was a public transportation plan done that I think is very good and interesting, and that's proposed an underground railway and all sorts of things. Anyway, certainly by the time the public transportation study done, the ideas for where the car parks would go was already in place, and they included King George Square as one place. I think Cathedral Square was probably one, although somewhere I saw in this that I've written something saying that was a newcomer, but it wasn't. I think the Northern Freeway, I think it was called, it came into town down Wharf Street, so it was an obvious place to put one. So my guess is I've got that wrong, and that probably what became Cathedral, what is that square called? The St John's one.
Cathedral
Place. Isn't that the one with
No,
fire?
that's the one with the fire. So that's, but it's Cathedral.
I think it's something Cathedral, but I don't know. I've never
Maybe
even been
this way.
inside it.
I've only driven past.
Yes. Anyway, the one next to opposite St John's. And I think probably Post Office Square perhaps also was another major potential underground car park for the city. So those were proposed, but they had been in play. The idea, at least for King George Square, had been in place before the cathedral, before the transportation plan. And from 1963, they were talking about the enlargement of King George Square and the incorporation of a car park as part of that. But it also had Albert Street to run through under the square.
And who made those plans?
Well, they were the City Council plan, but they became very public, and there were lots of letters to the paper and things, and that led to a competition for ideas for King George Square.
So these plans, these are the ones in the Brisbane City Archives for King George Square.
I've never looked at them.
Wait, there's a sketch.
No, I think they would be the final scheme for when the car park was in place. Or these for a variety. What are that? That's a different side.
Yeah, well.
Oh, that's leading up to Roma Street.
Leading up to Roma Street.
Oh, okay, to the guards.
So
no, I've never looked at them. I've never seen those. But there were, when they had the competition for ideas, which was substantially for that. It also coincided with the relocation of the city markets from there out to Urongpilly or whatever the suburb there is. And so that left in question what the long-term future of that part of town was. But the Bligh plan postdates the ideas competition, I think, and Bligh's would no doubt have put an entry in. But quite a lot of entrants to the competition did have for bigger sites than just the square. They expanded into this potential land to the north.
But the Bligh, is that the Roma Street redevelopment?
Yes, yes.
But it wasn't, that was commissioned as well by the Brisbane City Council?
No, by the state government.
By the state government.
And so Arthur Bligh was probably a reasonable smooger, and the government was quite, I think they're quite good. People can see the freeway is terrible and everything, but it was a time at which the government was kind of looking for input and questions and trying to rethink how the city might work, and that's the extent of urban renewal. Of course, became unpopular, but that was just urban renewal, like was going on everywhere in the world. That people were redoing their city centres and reorganising them, and the city council. I think after the competition, Blighs were then later commissioned to do the Bligh plan, the Roma Street redevelopment. But it comes out of all this other work.
So what's the relationship there between the City Council and the state government?
It was commissioned by the Coordinator General's Department, the Bligh plan, but that would include City Council representations. It was a government department to do with the overall state planning, and so they were interested in all the freeway plans, and it wasn't only Brisbane that did them, there were Townsville and all over the place, and they were interested generally in planning and long-term ideas. I think they were very bright people running it, even if their aesthetics may not be popular now at the moment, or even the wholesale way of planning. But anyway, the council would have had representation on them, and for all I know, but I might be wrong here, they were probably the people who assessed largely the town plan.
Right.
So the council still hadn't got a town plan at this stage. It's still in limbo, and it couldn't be finalised until such time as the transportation plan had been agreed. And once the transportation plan's agreed, that sets in place a whole lot of things. But there are other things also which you're not covering in this, which is that whole question of George Street, which I partially covered in the Supreme Court plan, because the issue of what was the state government going to do was an essential ingredient in the town plan also. Like, it was a big lump of the CBD that the state government controlled, and the future of that was also was in question at this time. But they're all interrelated with the transportation plan to greater or lesser extents. But the Bligh plan is a very discrete piece that came out of it, and they did this study that produced this report, and then the state government calls tenders for it. They would have gone ahead with it if any developer had taken it on, but I think they got no bids at all, and so the whole thing fizzled out. Well, not surprisingly, it was a ginormous risk for anyone. So, I mean, they just didn't get any tenders, and the whole thing fizzled out. But I mean, there's probably a political change that's occurred there too that I've forgotten by the time that all happened.
Okay.
Perhaps.
So the council made a town plan, or was planning to make a town plan once the transportation plan was in place.
Yeah, see, because the transportation plan affected such a large part, like it's not only CBD, it's all suburban part of Greater Brisbane. There were freeways going everywhere. You know, looking more like what's now, although I think what's now is much worse than what was envisaged. They were quite tight with their planning, where these people are absolute spendthrifts with land. And it's really sloppy. I think the original one was much nicer plan than what's happened.
Based on the town plan they commissioned competitions, or they organised competitions for these squares? Or
well, the council would later have... Well, see, then there were these other studies, and if you look at, say, the public transportation plan, that had quite a lot of ideas that eventually came to pass in Gibson's plan for Ransack Square, like ways of getting pedestrians through there and elevated things, and the tunnel that was built into... Well, that had been partially built in Burrell's car park was extended further into Astor Terrace on Spring Hill and things like that. But there were lots of plans in the public transportation plan, because it included pedestrian traffic as well as buses and trains and whatever. And so quite a lot of ideas for those sort of squares were being thought about, even if they weren't finalised. But then all the plans for the squares were eventually done by the council, not the state government.
And then the plans that we heard about by Langer and by Cummings, those were just...
They're just speculative, yes. Speculative to the conversation, yes.
But they were sort of prior to this conversation, though, because they're a bit earlier.
Which one?
The Langers and the Cummings and the...
No, the Cummings ones I don't think would be much earlier. Like, Cummings was involved ahead of the transportation plan, as I've said, from 1963 at least, and maybe earlier. But he was on a council, a limited council committee with the council clerk or town, I don't know who was the planner, I don't have his name or whatever.
I have it somewhere in my
That's right, yes. And so he was involved, but whether it predates that, but he might have had earlier ideas that might have provoked this committee at the council or something.
I do know there's one piece of writing maybe in his lectures that talks about the city plan or planning for Brisbane, and he sort of posits Tokyo as a model.
Yeah, you said that.
So I have to see if I can find that, because that's...
I think there would have been ideas being thrown up all over the time, like, you know, the council publishes drawings, say in 1961, that's earlier, which is illustrating cross-section for a new CBD with a range of ideas and things. So, I mean, I think you'd find a lot of ideas pop up. It's a question of when they get into some sort of systematic framework that might lead to some resolution. Because there are lots of ideas. I mean, the Anzac Square ideas are quite complicated further on, and the extension to Queen Street existed from quite early times, ideas that was a good thing to do.
Did I hear you correctly when you just said Gibson plan for Anzac Square?
Yes, Gibson did, after that, that's probably quite late, but Gibson did all the awful work. He did Post Office Square, the shopping centre under that side of it, on the Queen Street to Adelaide Street side, but he also did those raised walkways through that are particularly ugly, that give access into the existing building.
And that's in our period, or that was in the 80s?
It's probably later than your period,
okay.
yes. I don't know, when did Post Office Square get built? Is that into the 80s? Probably is, the extension. But the extension anyway was certainly current even before the war, as an idea.
Yeah, no, I didn't look at those files. It's in the 80s that there was another.
So we've got all these projects, King George Square, Roma Street development. Are there key plans or proposals we should be looking at for each of those ones?
Well, I mean, I must have seen something on the entrance in that competition. It would be in the paper. The thing would have been publicised and all the entrance and there's going to be. But these post-dated. Like this is more or less what got built. This is probably by Basil Veal, isn't it?
There is no
Oswald
name
and
on the
Veal.
plans. That's
there's no documentation.
They look like Oswald and Veal. I mean, that's almost what was built. That was the one that's just been pulled apart.
Well, there was no name on
so that's quite late in the piece. Like, when did that happen?
This was in the late 60s. That's what it says.
Yeah, well, that probably was when the ideas were finally sorted out.
It says Brisbane City Council, but it doesn't say a name of any architect. Proposed Civic Square and Roma Street precinct.
Well, the work was done by Basil Oswald Veal. I don't know what's
65
the initial.
is the date here.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, that's probably the outcome of that competition, I guess, and that that's sorted out more quickly than maybe I thought.
That was 65.
But whether that that predates by 2 years. This stuff.
The Roma Street development.
What was that? Sorry, 65.
65.
Okay.
65 is this one.
Well, it can't be the result of the competition, but maybe it's what the council decided to do as a result of the competition. Because when did Cummings do the Reserve Bank, which is the building on the right in that 3D view?
I don't know.
Well, it'll be in your period. If you go back to that 3D, that accident, that 1 point perspective, this view.
Yeah. The one above or the one below?
Oh, any one of these will do. Yeah, see, the building on the right is the Reserve Bank that Cummings was the advisor to the Comworks for. And then what's this? Well, this wasn't built in 65. I don't know what the date on that.
That's SGI.
It is SGIO, but it's not 18.
That's later.
It's later, that's right.
That's quite.
But I mean, the idea might have been simmering by then, but it postdates the executive building down here, which is what, 67 or something eventually. I'd have a date of it somewhere.
No, I can't.
The Conrad Gardner, but anyway, they only got that after they'd done the executive building. But it's very like what was built. Look at it, said what built. Here's the theatre.
Yes.
Is this? Do you think that's the same 65 or it's a later view?
I think it's the same. No, I think it's the same because the graphics are quite, and they're all.
The graphics are similar.
The graphics are similar.
Although there's a big jump between a plan and a perspective.
But there is no date on the perspective.
I think it's later. That'd be my guess.
Yeah.
Even if the plans are definitely 65.
65, yeah. Doesn't say for the perspective. There was this person. Wait, it's not a clear one. That's another perspective, but that's the same.
Yeah, see that was got what's built. There's no SGIO there. No, that's right.
So this might be the one accompanying the plans. I still have to look at them in more detail. And in one of the documents, it also said that Roman Revolution was involved in the planning, I think, of King George Square. His name was mentioned. No.
Who by?
It was just in one of the documents that his name wasn't.
Oh, he might have been on some committee. No, never worked for the council. And Works Department, I wouldn't have thought had a big place in it. And 65, he may not have even been working for the government. Well, he might have been in private practice. He might have put in an entry for the competition, maybe. But gee, he was out of the Works Department for 2 or 3 years at that time, about this time. So I'd be surprised. I've never heard him mention it.
Well,
there's nothing in his record.
In the documents, but I have to go through them again to see precisely in which context. But it was for King George.
Well, if he's just on a committee, that's one thing.
Possible.
But I don't think he, like he's involved in the court stuff earlier and again later.
And then you also mentioned when we spoke some time ago about this 1970 film that was made by SOM. Why did they come here, and what was
well, see, that's all to do with the George Street. That's this other story that I mentioned in passing. It's all to do with what the government's going to do with their land, and there are a series of stages in that, and Roman Pavlushin's involved in them. The very early stages, the 1950s, was to be the basis of that talk that I was going to give at Sarhan's, where he proposes a building as an extension of what became Family Services building. To the right-hand side of that from Queen's Gardens was sort of balancing the the building being slightly asymmetrical to the square, apart from providing accommodation. But that never got off the ground, and instead they went ahead with the executive building, which was to be the first of 3 blocks, and that's very like Stockholm. It's Normal or whatever that redevelopment of the centre of Stockholm is, and that so that they built that 1 block, and then there were to be 2 more blocks between it and Parliament House. But in the 1970s, that all starts coming undone, where people didn't like those big slab blocks anymore. They were seen as unsympathetic. There was interest in heritage, and so that was seen as unsympathetic environment for Parliament House and and then they developed this. It gets into the whole Bellevue hotel fight, where UDPA had taken on to do the study of the urban design of that part of George Street, Lower George Street, and they recommend that the Bellevue can be reused as the country residence or for some other use. And then they take on Lund Hutton, who says it's a load of shit and it's not possible to use it for anything. It's crap, and so it goes backwards and forwards with the consultants brawling, and then they take on Skidmore and Merrill, like, we can't get agreement with Australia's leading consultants, we need to go further. Okay. So they take on Skidmore's as the designers. But UDPA, just to confuse the issue, was left in place as the urban designers. So
SOM was just a consultant, they weren't really designing anything?
Yeah, no, they were the designer. They were designing the building, but UDPA had some overall input into urban design issues, whatever they might have been. And so when Skidmore present their plan, well, even before they presented their plan, the shit starts hitting the fan, where they say you can't get rid of the Bellevue, which they'd like. And so they kept the facade but moved it half a block west and tacked it onto the front of another building. And
would these plans also be in the city archives? Or
no, they're nothing to do with the city council. The council's only interested in what will happen to that land. The state government's not really beholden to the council at all, but they need to know what the state government's doing for their plan. But no, they're state government drawings.
So that'd be on a works?
Pardon?
All these would be on works?
There'd be drawings there, yes. There are drawings all over.
I remember you once saying Works were doing something with the film that SOM did.
Yes, well, I still should be able to find the film, but I might have trouble.
Why?
Oh, well, I don't have a copy. I don't think I've got a copy. But there are people around. We put 80 George Street up for the 25-year award.
That's right.
And I've always thought the Institute uses that in the most appalling way. Like, they don't use it strategically at all. They just give it to someone they like, and they didn't even talk to us about the building. I still think 80 George Street's good, the building that's now going to be knocked over. But we could see that coming, and so we hoped if we could get the 25-year award, that might give it some greater security, which I think it would have done. But with Cox Rain and everyone saying it's a load of rubbish, but it's I still think it's good. I don't know whether we've had a look at it, but I think in its own way it's splendid. And it's unfortunate that people like Jennifer Taylor, who does not, Jennifer's not my favourite person, although she's hugely productive, and I'm envious that she can get books out and everything, but she doesn't do much research, and she talks to people and then writes it up. And so the fact that that wasn't built till the 1985 or 86 or whatever, it was actually designed 10 years earlier, and it was right at the leading edge of those polygonal gridded plans. And if it had been built at the time it was first conceived, and when the first one it was documented a few times, it never got off the ground. It didn't go to tender and things. They built a cheap office block like Mineral House, absolute shit instead. But if it got off the ground at that time, then it would be seen as a really kind of pioneering thing, rather than a Johnny-come-lately scheme that's not even worth mentioning in her book.
So do you still have that entry that you developed for that?
Well, I don't have it, but it should still be around somewhere.
Because that'd be worth looking at. And the film, definitely.
Yes.
I know we talked about this a long time
ago. It's very boring, to be honest.
It's to be kind of good to see.
But it is funny. Well, we were so excited when we found it, and the government had to pay $400 to get a copy of it at the time, and we did spend some money on it. But then when it finally came, we didn't know what we were buying. But Skidmore's demanded a cost for converting it into video format.
Yes,
yeah.
But what is interesting about it is more the freeway. Like he was fascinated. I mean, it's part of making a case for the visual quality of the freeway, which I enlist Peter Cook periodically. He's a fan of it. And fortunately, every time he comes to town, he pipes up about it, saying it's his favourite bit of Brisbane or something. But the same Walter Netsch was interested in it when they're floating around in a boat in the river taking a film of the site. It all predates the skiing. He came to see the site and things.
Yes.
So it has the freeway under construction in the foreground but also the views of South Bank before.
Oh, that's
before
interesting.
That's happened.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So it is curious and it's quite boring. But it was only one of at least two films, and I might be wrong, there might even be a third one. And the last one's kind of stupid too, because Lundhut and Newell felt they shouldn't be outdone by an American, so they made their own film after they'd done the first scheme that was going to be built and it didn't go ahead. But they unfortunately had never given any thought to what a film was and how it needed to work. So they had a model, and the model just rotates endlessly with these architects standing behind it.
Talking about it.
And eventually, after a minute or two, John Morton can see this is ridiculous. So he throws a piece at the next door person. But it's just to make some, I can understand entirely. It was just stupid. There was nothing.
To get some action in the film.
But he doesn't flatten the guy, like he probably doesn't even hit him. But it's funny because he's regarded as a cantankerous person, so it's a funny image of him that matches people's reputation. But it wasn't, it was in response to the movie.
We should find that film as well then.
So the SOM film came from...
Skidmore's.
Yeah, they came from Skidmore's itself, okay. We'll have to go back to the original.
Oh, no, don't do that. No, don't pay again.
Well,
No, I'll try hard.
Now that it's been converted, they might be...
They might be more willing. And
it wasn't easy dealing with. It's all right to deal with, but it took quite a long time.
the plans that Virgo did for King George Square, that all predates the stage and architect.
Did Virgo do anything?
I think
King George Square.
That's what John said, that he had heard some of that.
Oh no.
It's not correct.
Ask for some evidence. See, Virgo was a state government employee. There's no, on the surface of, there'd be no reason why he should be doing plans of King George Square.
John seemed to have a recollection of that based on material he found for the architecture in the region course.
I was about to say, we do have some Virgo drawings at the school, so it might be in amongst that.
And
just
trying to remember.
Where did they come from?
They were just in a drawer under the steps in the School of Architecture.
Geez, that stuff should go over to France.
It should actually,
might disappear.
And a lot of it was going to disappear, so I sorted a whole bunch out and put them aside. So,
and that was earlier.
I think Virgo's quite good. John doesn't think he's too good, does he?
He didn't make.
And I don't know what to do. Well, I haven't seen these drawings, but Virgo is all right, I think. I think Virgo wasn't too bad.
Which period was that?
Well, see, he worked for the state government the whole time. From the time he came here as a cadet, he's in our directory, and I should remember that I don't. But he started working in the department maybe before the First World War and went right through till after the Second World War.
And did he
retired?
Did he then have a say in the state government in Roma Street and in all the plans that were developed, or in no?
Not in any of them. I would have thought, other than he just might have put in an entry to a competition that I wouldn't know about, and he might have done some private work, but I don't think so. He was a very hard-working employee. He did all those construction little books, and I'd be surprised, but I'd be very interested to see what they were. And if the department has drawings, I'd be interested if they're other than state government drawings. That'd be very interesting to me. And I'd be interested even if there are state government drawings, then I wouldn't have seen too many of his.
From what I can gather, these were private drawings of Virgo's himself.
A house?
Or just a whole bunch of things.
Residence or something?
No, a whole bunch of things, including little awards he got and things like that, that somehow ended up at the school.
Oh, well, they would have ended up there because he was a benefactor of the library and things, so, I mean, they probably got a range of stuff when he died, apart from his collection of books.
Unless this is stuff that the library rejected.
Well, they would have, wouldn't they?
It might be.
If they were plans, they might have taken the books. And
there's more drawings.
Yes, I know, but the library wouldn't have wanted the drawings, so they take the books, which have now been absorbed or got rid of or whatever, and the plans
They should all be in the storeroom. We should have a look. Are you in tomorrow?
Yes.
We could have a look.
But I'd be very interested in whatever they are.
Okay. No.
And if a list has been done, that would be very nice.
No, it was
so you don't remember that it was for King George Square?
Not for the life of me, no.
There's no, on the surface of, there is absolutely no reason why he would have been involved. The department didn't play a big role. See, the big player that's in behind this is the Department of the Coordinator General, which isn't work. Oh, it's Coordinator General Public Works, but that doesn't mean Public Works.
Okay.
There's a separate works department. This guy's into big civil infrastructure, civil engineering infrastructure and things. And in theory, he was involved in the planning of the expenditure on all government buildings, so he has a general oversighting role on what things get up and to get funded, and there would be works representation on his committees and things. But and conceivably there might be a circumstance where the competition's been held for the square. They want some idea of what might happen on Roma Street if they did commission someone, and they might say to Virgo, produce a bit of a plan. So it might be a precursor to this or something. So that's quite conceivable.
Okay, so
but in theory, he worked for Works his whole time, and
so he was not involved. There was something I was just. It slipped my mind. Sorry. It slipped my mind. There was something I just wanted to ask, and now it's gone. Yes, I remember. John also mentioned that Cummings gave quite a lot of television interviews or
radio, probably more than TV. I think
regarding King George Square, but that was in his capacity as member of this commission that they had erected for. And
as a general, person around town, that was interested, and he was making radio programs about various topics, wasn't he? They're not only that, I don't think.
I haven't heard them, but
I haven't either.
It wasn't a commentary or a criticism towards what was being planned. It was more of like an informative role that
he was involved. Cummings was involved in all sorts of things, the Art Gallery and the Wattle Day League, and that he got that funded scholarship. I think he had some continuing role, I think, maybe. But he was just a general activist around the town, and so he would be talking. I think people were talking. I don't think it was. It was all seen as contributing, but a lot of the architects hated plans that were made and things, and so there was negative criticism of various schemes that were proposed.
Yeah, there was a huge folder with objections to King George Square. There was just one folder of letters by architects objecting to the plans that were developed for King George Square. But he wasn't in the objections camp. He was in the other camp.
But the objections, I mean, some of them were no doubt valid. One I vaguely remember was that you couldn't plant any big trees and things. I mean, that's certainly right. Like it's never had any sizable trees. If you fill the thing under, you could, but you have to make special provision, which certainly wasn't made.
Like in Melbourne, where they did that car
park
on the university.
It is fabulous. Yeah. Well, that guy would have been around almost at this time up here, or had been anyway. I forget his name. What's his name? Ex-Brisbane person, or had been in Brisbane?
Don't know.
No, I forget too.
Don't know. Now I have to check.
I think it's a fairly fluid situation. Like, I don't think any of the positions would be too fixed. Like people are just commenting in a way that, say, doesn't happen much to the same extent now.
That's probably interesting, actually, because the fact that the debate does seem to be quite public and quite fluid and quite active.
Well, I think even the transportation plan is a much more public document than anything to do with the tunnels or the shocking changes, out along Lutwich Road and north of Bowen Hills, which is all more or less fait accompli, or that people say I'm wrong, they'd have displayed the model somewhere. But it was all in place with the model displayed. These things were displayed, presented as drawings and things rather.
Do you have any idea who at Blythes and Bretnell worked on the Roma Street redevelopment? Because the plans don't have names on them again, and then looking for
Arthur Bly. I mean, it was mostly called the Bly Plan, and so Arthur Bly, did do the running for it, but. And aren't there any initials? You can't see any initials on the perspective. Well, that wouldn't be a clue anyway.
No, well, I have the original plans from their archive.
But they probably. There's a big panel, aren't there? But not today. There are a lot of people represented on it. But just
because we're still looking for a respondent for the Roma Street redevelopment as well. And if you have any idea of who might be good for they
could be dead, and in the end, it's a quite thorough, comprehensive bit of work and things. It was a bit peripheral to it was, sorry, I don't suppose so. If it had happened, it would have had a different significance, but I think it was all ridiculously inflated for what might get off the ground, if you know what I mean.
Well, I was going to ask that question. A lot of these schemes seem quite ambitious if you consider the population of Brisbane at that time. So you just sort of wonder, is this really... What were the key concerns? About it, I think. I like that, but it's just kind of interesting that, even Cummings citing Tokyo as a model for Brisbane, I think is fascinating. So do you think they had particular visions for Brisbane in terms of its population growth?
I do think, I think there are a few things about that. One is I think they did have visions and things, but the other thing, I think more was possible then. Like all the time, as time goes on, it gets harder and harder to make any significant change. Like the chances to do any I wouldn't have dreamt it was possible to get away with what the road changes are, recent ones, but...
Well, they're meant to be underground.
Underground.
They're meant to be underground.
Well, underground is kind of comparably harmless, but all the stuff above ground is completely shocking, I think. But anyway, I would have thought it was terribly hard to make a really significant change anymore, but... I think they get increasingly stupid, like thinking the river's a bit of real estate and thinking any park is still real estate. And, it's shocking, really, I think, the level at which... And not keeping anything either is the other appalling bit of it, I think. Like, I can't believe I knocked down to 80 George Street, really, and put another casino. And the new office block is just completely, outrageously ludicrous. Like, it's costing the public billions more to do what they're now doing rather than to have done a state government to build a building. And it would have been cheaper again if they'd just stayed where they were, which they're perfectly able to do.
But don't they want to knock down the executive building for
Well, they do. Well, that's right. That's the kind of plan. They hope they can flog it to someone. But I think the bigger plan is just, it's money for their mates. There's the banker mates and who can fund, arrange the financing and civil. It's terrible. It's absolutely disgusting.
Same with the schools, like Fortitude Valley. It's all very dodgy.
Disgusting. Anyway, but that's going to be terribly intrusive. The new office block is ginormous.
I haven't seen
it's absolutely huge. It's much bigger, say, than Brisbane Square, I think. Plonked right down there on the river, God, it'll be ugly too. It's all cut price. I think, but anyway, I think it is harder to do things. But I think they did have there was more general interest, but that's partly post-war.
Yes, that's
People
true.
wanting to do things, and part of that whole idea of urban renewal, that it was possible to do things. And
the idea of modernity.
Okay.
But a lot of people, some things did, this carried on in various ways. I think once the plan was in place, other people did do schemes based on parts of it. Like I think John Andrews did a scheme that didn't look too unlike that for Roma Street.
John Andrews?
But it would be later probably than it would be in the, I would think in the 80s more than the 70s, but anyway, may not be. But he certainly did one scheme for here for a developer firm, and so there are probably bits and pieces floating around the town that people had, but whether anyone will talk about it. If John Andrews did do something, John Simpson would have done something, would have been involved. Because he was running the idea of the office up here, but I don't know when he came, but it might be the 80s, is it? When did chemical engineering happen at UQ?
I think it's 80s,
Yeah, it would be.
Yeah. Is there any is there a good history that's been written on any of this material? Does Rob Freestone cover any of this in his books, do you know?
I think he'd cover a bit. I mean, I don't have a good collection of Rob Freestone's books, and I do hate them. I mean, I did look today, preparing for this, look up that one of them is an e-book online, and it's just horrible to use as a book. It is so slow and a lot of pages don't all load, and then you want to look at the footnotes, but they're miles away, and if you go there, you can't come back.
I'm going to let John listen to this. John wants to do an e-book, and I'm objecting, but now I'm going to let him listen to what you say.
It is very, very difficult to use. Like you can't, and if you want to go back and look at something, it's bloody annoying. And then I wanted to make it bigger, and that threw me right back to the beginning of the bloody thing. And it's not friendly as something to look at. I mean, it might be alright if it's like a novel where you're just reading through it, but a reference book where you want to flick backwards and forwards and check stuff, it is
doesn't
horrible.
work. But there's no Queensland writers that have sort of written a general history of the city.
No, well, to some extent, that's a bit where I was headed a bit, in that you know, I mean, it covered the road systems and things, and the George Street bit with the Supreme Court, and then the Sahans aborted paper that got a long way was one, and then the lower George Street would have been one. And once I tried to talk Works into doing a Works department involvement in the history in the CBD, but they weren't interested at all, so it didn't go anywhere.
But do you think the Roma Street redevelopment plan is good enough to discuss it during the forum? Do you think it's important that we discuss this one too, or
I don't know?
Or would the George Street be more interesting?
Yes, that's one.
Well, more the George Street story kind of has longer life than this. Like this is pretty brief. Like they do it, they call tenders, they don't get any, and apart from these little bits that might flow on. But there are other bits, say you haven't talked about at all, like the whole question of the cultural centre of the town, where that should go, is another whole issue again that flows around through this period and earlier, and you know. But then after what was going to the gallery was to be in the gardens, and in their scheme they propose it going here. It's part of this scheme.
Who proposed that? The Roma Street proposed a cultural centre.
Well, Blythe did, or maybe it was part of the brief, but it's in this scheme. If you look at the plan, well, I think it is in the copy I've seen.
And then ultimately
they've got strange buildings on the. They're awful, actually.
That's a good point. We haven't considered that, mainly because we were thinking of doing a separate one on.
All the buildings on the other side of Rock. Maybe there's other versions of this.
Are we still doing it?
It depends on Gibson.
It was all going above these buildings. Was the art gallery and the performing arts centre.
And were there other suggestions made prior to this about the
I think that probably it could well be that it's all to do with Arthur Blythe. See, this is the art centre.
Art centre, yes.
Yes, and an exhibition centre. So there were things there. So, but I suspect that might have come from their competition entry for King George Square, or maybe they just threw it in as something else that could happen. But it might have been part of the brief. I don't know. But anyway, it didn't get too far again, but then there was the other question of where it should be sited, and that was to be the basis of that event I was proposing to have here, where they do a study that looked at 3 sites. Cathedral Square down in the valley was one, the tram depot in Coronation Drive, roughly where the Goodwill Bridge go-between bridge ends up. And then South Bank is one, and the South Bank one got up, and then that's a competition in your period, the art gallery competition, and then it morphs into the whole cultural centre, and that was the kind of thing that I thought might have marginally made an event, because the mechanism of how that happened was always curious, but whether any of the parties would be prepared to say what they. So I don't think that's a goer anymore, but anyway, I think that's a curious. I thought that was almost enough for those limited events. Like one event, if you get people saying, but I didn't do this for the Liberal Party campaign of 1973 election or whatever. Someone might in the audience question it, and maybe it might trigger a response.
I think we're still thinking of doing it.
Yeah, we're still thinking of doing it, but John kind of suggested that would depend on if Robin Gibson.
Yeah, well, he's well again now.
Yes. He just fell off his chair trying to pick something up, and apparently there were many doctors there that were very confused.
Whoever reacted.
And they just sent him to the hospital.
Okay. Yeah. But I mean, at the same time, I don't think Gibson's ideal. Like, he's not a great
talker.
Or have you spoken to him yet? Have you?
No, I only saw him once when he came to the forum and then left before it ended.
Oh,
so.
No, he's not. I don't think he's good like this. But anyway, some people disagree with that.
At least he came. So
he doesn't admit of where ideas come from. They all come out of his head, and once they've got total egotism. No, it's not unusual. But eventually people say, "But I was interested in someone," and then you say, "But it's like that." And yes, it is a bit, and it built on some other idea that existed.
He won't acknowledge it.
Well, I don't think so. I think you'd be flat out getting him to say that it all came from Roach Dinkloo.
But could we do a forum on the development at South Bank without him? Do you think that's...
Well, I think so. I think what's happened at South Bank is the kind of biggest area where things have kind of eventually altered, except for the road damage. And that's a whole big section of town that got redeveloped.
Completely redone, yeah.
But a lot of it's later in your period. But the bones of creating an environment in which Expo might happen were in place in your period.
In the cultural centre, yeah.
We should check the proposals for putting this cultural centre in our period then maybe already for leading up to the next one. So it's a good suggestion.
Okay.
I don't have any more questions. I think we have a lot of information already. Unless you think there's something else that you could add that might help us find more.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think so much has gone on in other parts of town. Like the Valley's all much more recent. I mean, there are other earlier periods where things happen, like centenary plays, that could have made a kind of story of what was proposed. And Bob, I think, has ideas that didn't know that the town hall was going there at one stage, but I don't know. I've never seen that. But I'm not saying he's wrong. I just haven't seen it. But that was a key part of the town in the 1920s. What should happen there, but that had all fizzled out by this time. Well, I think when the cathedral stalled completely, and the valley went into decline, probably by around that time. So I don't think the valley is an issue for you particularly.
Okay.
And the action there had gone before you start. So.
Well, but the way I see this forward now happening is that it might be a good idea if you could open with a little talk about the transportation study and how that transportation study led to proposals for these different squares, or how that gave rise to that, and then we have other people focusing on the squares and the plans that were proposed for those and going through that. If you agree with kind of a setup like that.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds good because it does, have that flowing. I think interconnection. Yeah. So, how long do you want each speaker to speak?
10 minutes.
Maximum. Done. There you go. Done.
But you get 10 minutes, but then the idea is that based on what you said in those 10 minutes, there will be some discussion after, and there will be...
So you get 10 minutes to do a pre-prepared talk, essentially. Does everybody do their pre-prepared talks?
Yes.
Yeah, and then we have responses.
And run us through some of the plans that were proposed, and I think, yours is the key one because you did transportation and that affected all these other proposals, so I think it's just the idea that... maximum 10 minutes you run through some plans and see what was proposed, what was eventually built, and what it led to, and the others will do the same, I think, for these squares.
And at the moment you're not sure who the others are?
I think Robert Riddell will do King George Square, and we don't have anybody yet for Post Office and Anzac Square, and I'm not sure if we're going to do Roma Street or not. That's
maybe we want to do George Street too, because I think that really sounds interesting.
Well, if you have suggestions for people that you think might be good that know a lot about these other...
Gee, I think it's piling it on too much.
Probably a bit much, yeah.
Yeah, it's completely...
What are the more important squares then, if we're talking about...
King George.
So King George.
And Anzac was the other one. Post Office Square and Anzac
Queen's
Square.
Gardens was the earlier one, which was... But it's 1900.
Too early.
Yeah. Revamped in 63 in your period, but...
Because I do think we shouldn't have any more than 3, really.
No, I don't think you're late, because I think in the end you think, God, what came out of that?
This is too much.
Yeah.
And it might, in the discussion, lead to interesting things. So you can possibly make connections, say, just quick side comments that, that these later schemes might be connected, which might open discussion. But and the plan is to have an invited audience.
Yes.
So if we're going to have an invited audience, is there anyone we should invite, Dom?
We're going to invite everybody that we interviewed so far. That's
so you're
that's about
Bruce Paulson too.
he came to me after the last forum and he said, "You're going to invite me for the next one."
Yes,
I hope so.
Yes.
So while he was outraged, he still wants to come. That's perfectly all right.
Yeah.
So, but are there people from works in these departments that we should be inviting?
Well, there would be if you're going to talk about George Street, perhaps, but see, this is really the council and the coordinator general people. Like Sid Schubert's still alive, but I don't know that he may have come to that freeway talk I gave. But he's very incapacitated. Like I don't think he did. I think other people.
No,
did.
he was going. He wanted to, but I don't.
Yeah,
think
that's right. No, I think that's it.
Yeah.
But do you think we should talk to him? Do you think it might be useful for us to interview him or not?
Because I know with the Riverside Expressway, we had good people in. I thought that was quite good when we had people that were involved in the projects. But
we'll see. I mean, that's another few years of elapsed too, and he wasn't well a while ago, so I don't know. I mean, they were interested in the freeway stuff because they feel they've been maligned and all that stuff. Well, they're forgotten partly, but it is remembered not with any players. So they didn't mind me coming along and. But there are people about the square, there would be, but I don't know, we should talk to Bob about it, but people like Basil Veal, who did the documentation, I think, or maybe he did Anzac Square. No, I've got it wrong about King George Square. Who did that? That's that guy that did Glen Craig up on Leichhardt Street, top of Upper Edward Street. I think might have done it. I don't remember, but I mean the council you'd think would have more drawings. You said they have no more drawings than what they showed you.
That seems strange.
That seems very strange. I've asked them and they said, well, I'm going back tomorrow morning, so...
And even documentation.
You think the document, they ought to hold a set of the document, but they might, it might be in town somewhere.
I think
in the council works branch.
Well, okay, yeah. Because even
it's just never gone to the archives.
The competition drawings and stuff too, you'd wonder where they would be,
return to the authors.
To the authors, do you think
probably.
They don't
it wasn't a formal council competition, I don't think. It might have been, but it might have been run by the Courier Mail even.
Okay, well that's what I was thinking. We should definitely check the Courier because... It
had no official status anyway.
Oh, okay, alright.
It was ideas which might give it marginal status, but I don't think it was any official status in terms of actually realising the ideas. It was more collecting, brainstorming.
The Courier Mail and the Council Works Department.
But if Basil Veal wasn't involved, he was involved in the later Post Office Square one. Yes, see, that's Frank Oswald. No, he was in partnership with Frank Oswald, the guy I was trying to think of. I think they had, I might be wrong, but I think they might have been involved in King George Square. But it's so shittily done, and I don't know what Basil Veal would be like. He was opinionated.
That's good.
I got the best. Oh no!
Because it provokes opinions.
Oh no, it doesn't. It shuts everyone up. Everyone thinks,
okay.
When can we go and have a pizza?
Or something stronger.
Okay, so the Courier Mail, of course, Basil Veal. Yeah, well, if you think of...
What's Bob's interest in King George Square?
Well, it was John that said that Robert should do that because he did later on works on King George Square and in the frame of the works that he did on the City Hall, that he might have had more documentation
to do research for it.
Yes, that's how I understood why he should do King George Square.
Okay.
He worked for Conrad and Gallagher too, didn't he? So was he in SGIO or
no?
He'd gone overseas before it was built.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.